had that really distinct kind of unsettling feeling that the fundamental social contract of our civilization was just, quietly rewritten.
Like somebody swapped out the rules when you weren't looking.
Exactly. Like
Yeah.
nobody bothered to ask for your signature on this new contract. I mean, I'm talking about the invisible rules of how we actually relate to one another.
Yeah, no, the legal system judges us, or how the corporate world values us.
Right, how society assigns basically our fundamental human worth. Have you ever felt like you're playing a game where the referee completely swapped out the rule book while you were, busy working a 50-hour week?
It's a profound, almost paralyzing sense of disorientation, really.
It is.
It's that feeling that the ground beneath you has completely shifted, but the map you were handed by your parents and your teachers still shows the old terrain.
Right, so you step where the map says there should be solid ground, and boom, you find yourself in a minefield.
A total minefield.
And if you are listening to this deep dive right now, whether you consider yourself a men's rights activist or you navigate the spaces that are often called the manosphere, or honestly, if you're just the kind of learner who is insanely curious about the hidden architecture of modern power, you are in exactly the right place today.
Oh, definitely. Because today we are exploring a highly controversial forensic framework that claims to map exactly how and why that social contract was altered.
Yeah, we are looking at a text that promises to expose the history of our modern institutions before they were, in the author's view, entirely captured by ideological forces like feminists and Marxists.
It's a heavy subject.
It is. But before we unpack the mechanics of this system, I want to quickly remind everyone tuning in to please like and subscribe to the show. Your support is, frankly, what allows us to keep tackling these massive, complex topics week after week.
And today is definitely a massive topic.
Huge. We're conducting a comprehensive review of a recently published and honestly highly provocative ebook. It's titled Duluth Misandry Wheel by Sophie Marie Eve Riker.
Which is a text that basically claims to completely dismantle the architecture of modern institutional bias.
Right, and if you want to follow along or, audit these arguments for yourself, which we highly recommend, you should absolutely check Amazon Kindle and Google Playbooks to buy the book.
Yeah, get a copy, read the citations.
Exactly. And also, make sure to follow at Conrad Riker at Substack for a lot more content exploring this author's universe. It's definitely a rabbit hole.
It really is. I mean, it is a dense, completely unapologetic piece of writing.
Yeah.
It demands your full intellectual attention, regardless of where you currently sit on the, political or cultural spectrum.
Which actually brings us to a very, very crucial disclaimer before we jump into the deep end of the pool here.
Right, we need to lay down the ground rules for this deep dive.
Exactly. Our mission today is to provide an exhaustive, incisive, and purely analytical review of the Duluth Misandry Wheel.
Purely analytical.
Right, because this source material deals with highly politically charged content, looking deeply at gender dynamics, institutional capture, structural bias, through a very specific red pill lens. We need to be crystal clear with you. We are not taking sides.
No, we are absolutely not endorsing the viewpoints, the politics, or the specific claims contained within this text.
Not at all. Our goal here is strictly impartial reporting. We are just here to analyze the architecture of the author's arguments so that you, the listener, can fully understand the concepts.
We want you to understand the history and the framework presented in the original text without us putting our thumb on the scale.
Think of us as your tour guides to the material. We are simply mapping the territory exactly as the author drew it.
Right, we're looking at the logic, the specific sociological and historical evidence she cites, and the underlying philosophy she uses to build her entire case.
The goal is clarity, nothing else. So let's start digging. To understand the author's core premise, this whole idea that our institutions have been fundamentally captured and reprogrammed, we apparently have to travel back in time.
Yeah, back to a very specific place and a very specific policy shift.
Right. The book points to the year 1981 in Minnesota. And as I was reading this, I kept wondering, why is a local policy from the early 80s the foundation of her entire argument about modern society?
Well, to understand the modern architecture, Riker argues we have to look at the cornerstone. And that cornerstone was literally laid in 1981 in Duluth, Minnesota.
Okay, so what actually happened in Duluth?
A group of local activists and sociologists came together to create what was officially called the Domestic Abuse Intervention Project, or DAIP.
Okay, DAIP, and what did they produce?
Out of this specific project, they produced a visual and conceptual flowchart. They called it the Power and Control Wheel.
The power and control wheel?
Yeah. And today, in legal and sociological circles, it is widely known simply as the Duluth model.
Okay, wait. A flowchart from a local, intervention project in Minnesota eventually went global. How did that happen, and why does the author claim it was so deeply destructive?
Well, the author actually describes the creation of the Duluth model as one of the most successful acts of etymological hijacking in modern history.
Etymological hijacking. Okay, meaning they didn't just change a local policy, they changed the literal definition of a word.
Exactly. They changed the grammar of reality itself, according to the text.
How so? What was the old definition?
Historically, and in a strict, objective legal sense, the concept of abuse or violence was tied to a physical act.
Right, it meant somebody actually hit somebody.
Right. It denoted the objective initiation of physical force. Law enforcement would look at an incident and ask, what happened? Who initiated the physical contact?
What was the physical result of that initiation, right? It was an act-based framework.
Precisely. But Riker argues that the Duluth model changed the concept entirely. It argued that domestic violence was not an interpersonal conflict or an objective act of physical force.
Then what was it?
It was redefined as an inherent symptom of masculinity and patriarchal control.
Okay, wow. So the crime is no longer defined by what actually occurred in the physical world, but by the biological sex and the presumed societal power of the person standing in the room.
That is exactly how she frames it. The author writes that the very first axiom of this new theoretical framework explicitly excluded female perpetrators and male victims from its canvas.
It just erased them entirely from the jump.
Yeah. By defining domestic violence strictly as a patriarchal resource extraction mechanism, like a tool used by men to subjugate women, the model institutionalized a predefined villain.
That is wild.
And the framework is so expansive that, for example, if a man makes a unilateral financial decision in the household under the Duluth framework, he isn't viewed as being decisive or taking on the burden of providing.
What is he viewed as?
He is officially categorized as asserting financial control. It's a form of abuse. The book points out that the concept of male privilege itself is literally printed on the wheel as a distinct form of abuse.
Wait, hold on. So just existing in a traditional masculine role or exhibiting traditional male behaviors like, stoicism or financial management is classified by this model as an ongoing crime scene.
That is exactly the author's contention, yes.
Mm-hmm.
The model presumes that the masculine structure itself is inherently coercive.
Okay, here is where I have to pause because I think any reasonable person listening to this right now is going to have a massive question.
I know exactly what you're going to ask.
If the author is claiming that this Duluth model essentially ignores reality and just constructs a fictional narrative of universal male guilt, how on earth does she account for the reality of actual domestic violence?
Right, does she just ignore it?
Yeah, does she just wave a hand and ignore the fact that women are genuine victims of horrible domestic violence every day?
It's the obvious counterargument, and the author definitely anticipates it. She addresses it by leaning really heavily into a massive body of empirical data.
Okay, so she doesn't deny it happens.
She absolutely does not deny the existence of domestic violence or the severe harm it causes to female victims.
Then what is her argument?
Her argument is that the Duluth model intentionally ignores the reciprocal and bidirectional nature of most domestic violence in order to maintain its ideological narrative.
Bidirectional violence, meaning both people are fighting. What data is she looking at to actually support that claim?
She cites several major sources, but she primarily focuses on the CDC's National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey.
The NISVS, right?
Yeah, the NISVS. She also pulls from decades of sociological research conducted by scholars like Murray Strauss and John Archer.
And what does that specific data reveal that contradicts this Duluth model flowchart?
Well, the author points out that when you look at the raw data from these really extensive surveys, it consistently demonstrates near parity in the initiation of violence across demographics.
Near parity, so roughly equal.
Exactly. The research she cites indicates that women initiate and carry out acts of domestic aggression, like slapping, throwing objects, hitting at rates that are equal to, and in some specific demographics, even exceeding those of men.
Wow. So the data suggests the actual initiation of conflict is relatively symmetrical in a lot of households.
Yes. However, and this is a really crucial distinction the author makes so we don't misrepresent her, the injury outcomes can differ wildly due to biological reality.
Because men are generally bigger and stronger.
Right. The strength disparities between the average man and the average woman mean that male violence is far more likely to result in severe physical injury.
That makes biological sense.
But the authors points that the initiation of the violence, the actual bidirectional nature of household aggression where both parties are engaging in physical conflict, is completely flattened and erased by the Duluth model.
I see. So she's saying that the model takes a specific, truly horrific subset of violence where men severely injure women and uses it to paint the entire picture of male-female dynamics.
She calls it the fallacy of composition.
Fallacy of composition. Break that down.
The Duluth framework takes the genuine actions of a very small percentage of highly violent, predatory male offenders, the absolute extreme anomaly, and it universalizes that pathology across the entire demographic of ordinary men.
So it takes the worst of the worst and declares it the standard operating procedure for all masculinity.
Exactly. It effectively makes male existence probable cause. If you are a man, you carry the original sin of the worst men in society.
Okay, but how does this abstract sociological theory actually operate in the real world? Like when the police show up at a house? Because a flowchart on a whiteboard in 1981 is one thing, but the book claims this captured our actual legal institutions.
It did. And to illustrate how the theoretical wheel hits the actual pavement, the author details a specific 2017 audit of mandatory arrest protocols in California.
Okay, let's get into this. This is where you see the architecture of presumed guilt operating in real time, right?
Yes.
Break that down for us. What happens during these mandatory arrests, according to the audit?
We'll think about a dual arrest situation. The police receive a call about a domestic disturbance. They arrive at the residence, and it is a chaotic scene.
Both parties are yelling. Maybe both are involved in an altercation.
Right. Both are involved. The state of California audited these specific scenarios, and the data showed something really startling.
Oh, was it?
In dual arrest situations, roughly 40% of the time, the male was the primary physically injured party.
Wait, 40% of the time?
Yes, he was the one bleeding. He was the one with the visible lacerations or bruises.
But the outcome of the police intervention didn't reflect that physical reality.
It absolutely didn't, because the responding officers were legally bound to operate under Duluth-informed procedural protocols.
And what do those protocols demand?
Those protocols mandated that the officers identify the dominant aggressor. And under the Duluth framework, the dominant aggressor is almost always determined by average size, weight differential, and presumed societal power.
So the state, guided by this ideological model, didn't investigate the objective initiation of the violence at all.
No. As Riker writes, the system literally weighed the participants on a scale. The physical blood on the man's shirt was rendered invisible by an ideology that only recognizes male bones as potential weapons and female tears as the only valid evidence.
That is an incredibly vivid and honestly disturbing image. The system decides the moral and legal weight of a physical act based entirely on the perpetrator's biological sex.
That's the argument, yeah.
So, under this framework, if a woman strikes a man, how does the system process that?
The system facilitators instantly reclassify her physical aggression as preemptive self-defense against his oppressive presence.
Wow, so she can't even be the aggressor conceptually.
The author argues it creates an unfalsifiable loop of logic, like a closed syllogism.
Give me the steps of that syllogism.
Premise 1. All domestic discord is rooted in patriarchal power. Premise 2. Men are the primary agents of this patriarchy. Conclusion. Therefore, the male is always the primary aggressor.
Because the conclusion is baked into the very first premise, objective physical evidence becomes mathematically unnecessary.
It's a trap. Riker calls it a paralyzing Kafka trap.
Think about how a man is supposed to react in that situation. Like, what does he do when the cops show up?
Right. If the police arrive and he is silent, the Duluth manual suggests he is withdrawing to assert emotional control.
And if he speaks up?
If he raises his voice to defend himself and explain his side of the story, he is labeled as intimidating and escalating the situation.
And if he just breaks down?
If he breaks down and cries out of sheer frustration, he is documented as being manipulative. There is literally no behavioral response available to him that proves his innocence, because his guilt was established the moment he was born male.
Okay, this brings up a massive structural question for me.
Sure, go ahead.
If the Duluth model is the institutional hardware, the actual written policy protocols, the police flowcharts, the legal mandates, how did society get programmed to accept it so readily?
That is the big question.
Right, because you don't just roll out a federal or state policy that ignores a bleeding man in his own kitchen unless the culture is already primed to look the other way. The public has to be, on some level, okay with that blindness.
This is perhaps the most fascinating layer of the author's analysis.
Mm.
She argues that the hardware of the Duluth model was easily installed because human beings run on a very specific psychological operating system.
What does she call this operating system?
She points to a concept called gamma bias.
Gamma bias. I was chewing on this concept a lot while reading, and I actually want to test an analogy with you to see if I am grasping the author's mechanics here.
Yeah, let's hear it.
Okay, imagine society is a massive, complex audio soundboard in a recording studio.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
On this board, you have different volume sliders for different demographics and their respective issues. According to the book's logic, the volume slider for female pain, distress, or discomfort is permanently locked at a 10. It's amplified, it's booming through the stadium speakers, and the entire institutional crew rushes to fix the feedback immediately.
Yep.
But the slider for male pain, male depression, workplace injury, suicide, alienation is completely muted. It doesn't matter how loud the input signal is. No sound comes out of the societal speakers. Is that an accurate read of how she defines gamma bias?
It is. In fact, taking your soundboard idea a step further, the author argues that the state is actually the audio engineer, and they have deliberately hardwired the board so that the male slider literally cannot be pushed up.
Wow. Okay, so where does this term come from?
The term gamma bias was coined by evolutionary psychologists Martin Seeger and John Barry. They presented extensive research to the British Psychological Society demonstrating this exact cognitive asymmetry in how human beings process suffering.
How does that asymmetry function in practice, according to their research?
Their research showed that female distress is systematically amplified by the culture. It is magnified, it is deeply personalized, it is instantly believed.
And it's turned into a compelling narrative.
Yes, and crucially, it is funded. Meanwhile, male suffering is systematically minimized.
How so?
It is dismissed as whining. It is collectivized into dry statistics so it loses its emotional punch. It is pathologized as a personal moral failure, or in the worst cases, it is simply reframed as a threat to others.
But I want to challenge the text's framing of this as a malicious institutional capture for a
I'll
second.
make that devil's advocate.
Doesn't the author admit that this bias isn't some grand Marxist or feminist conspiracy, but actually an ancient evolutionary survival reflex? I mean, aren't we just biologically wired as mammals to care more about the safety of females?
She absolutely acknowledges the biological root of it. She explores what psychologists call the women are wonderful effect, which is rooted deeply in our savanna survival instincts.
Right, the reproductive bottleneck.
Exactly. From a cold evolutionary perspective, females are the reproductive bottleneck of any species' survival. You can rebuild a tribe with a few surviving males and many females.
But you cannot rebuild it with many males and few females.
Right. The instinct to shield the reproductive bottleneck runs deeper than human language. It's a hardwired reflex in the human nervous system.
So it's not a conspiracy, it's biology.
Studies consistently show that both men and women exhibit a measurable intrinsic preference for protecting women over men.
Okay, so if she admits that it is a completely natural biological reflex, why is she arguing that it is a profound societal problem?
Because the author leans heavily into classical philosophy to make her point here. She draws on Aristotle, the Stoics, and the natural law tradition.
And what do they say about natural reflexes?
She argues that an evolutionary instinct is not a moral ethic. A biological reflex is not a principle of justice.
Ah, I see.
What separates a highly advanced just civilization from a savanna pack is our intellectual capacity to recognize a primitive biological bias and intentionally correct for it.
Correct for it through reason, objective truth, and equal application of the law. We are supposed to rise above the savannah.
Exactly. But her contention is that modern institutions have done the exact opposite. They haven't corrected for gamma bias. They have weaponized it and codified it into binding legal procedure.
They took a biological blind spot and made it the law of the land.
They have taken an ancient evolutionary reflex and turned it into the operating system of the modern administrative state.
And the book uses a really striking historical metaphor to illustrate this, what she calls Titanic arithmetic.
Yes, the sinking of the Titanic is the perfect encapsulation of the old chivalric contract.
Yeah.
The order given on the deck was women and children first.
Right.
That moral arithmetic assumed, without question, that male bodies were expendable by design. It assumed that a man's life was literally worth less than a woman's safety and comfort.
And Riker argues that the specific moral arithmetic has never actually been repealed by modern society. It has just been bureaucratized.
Right. We no longer ask men to stand on a sinking ship. but we ask them to absorb the crushing weight of the economic and social infrastructure in absolute silence.
And she backs up this claim of male disposability with some incredibly heavy statistics. I mean, the numbers she lays out regarding where the actual physical suffering happens in society are incredibly stark.
They are undeniable. She cites Bureau of Labor Statistics data showing that men account for over 92% of all workplace fatalities.
92%, that is a staggering number.
Men lay the boiling asphalt, they maintain the high voltage power lines, they work the deep sea oil rigs, they log the forests.
They do the dirty, dangerous, and often lethal labor that keeps the physical infrastructure of civilization from collapsing overnight.
Furthermore, she cites CDC data showing that men account for nearly 80% of all suicide deaths.
80%.
They constitute the vast, overwhelming majority of the unsheltered homeless population, the incarcerated population, and the victims of violent street crime.
Yet, when you look at those massive, glaring disparities in suffering and mortality, the institutional response, the funding, the media attention, the federal grants doesn't match the crisis at all.
It's the empathy gap in full operation. The author points out that male-specific health initiatives, male suicide prevention, or programs aimed at unsheltered men receive only a microscopic fraction of the public and private funding that is automatically directed toward female-centric initiatives.
It goes back to the soundboard analogy. If a female demographic voices pain or disparity, the administrative state activates immediately.
Task forces are formed, Title IX staff are deployed, HR teams mobilized, crisis guides are printed, and federal grants are issued.
And if a male demographic voices pain,
If a man voices pain, he is largely told to pull himself up by his bootstraps to stop being fragile.
or increasingly his pain is diagnosed by the therapeutic state as a symptom of his own toxic masculinity.
Exactly. The bureaucracy simply doesn't solve male problems because it doesn't know how to metabolize male suffering into budgets, staff positions, and political capital.
So two people can experience identical harm. For one, the system treats it as a systemic crisis demanding a massive federal grant. For the other, it's treated as a personal, moral failure to be filed away in the dark.
That is gamma bias in a nutshell.
Okay, so if this cognitive distortion, this gamma bias, is the water we are swimming in, how does it alter the daily interpersonal relationships between ordinary men and women?
Right, because it's not just a top-down government thing.
No, it's happening in living rooms and on dates. And this brings us to a concept the author calls state husbandry, which really stuck with me. How did the fundamental deal between men and women change?
To fully grasp state husbandry, we have to examine the historical contract of chivalry, which the author views through a very unromantic analytical lens.
Okay, so take the romance out of it. What was historical chivalry?
She describes historical chivalry as a brutal but ultimately reciprocal transaction. Historically, a man offered protection, provision, and sacrifice, often laboring unto death to secure resources.
He provided the physical security.
But in return for taking on that immense life-shortening burden, he received reciprocal rights from the culture and his partner.
What were those rights?
He was granted authority within his household. He received a cultural expectation of female loyalty. He was afforded communal respect as a patriarch, and he had guaranteed paternity and access to his children.
So you give something massive, you get something substantial in return. It may have been a harsh, unforgiving contract shaped by a hard world, but it was a mutual exchange.
Right. It was balanced. But modernity, according to Riker's framework, performed a remarkable, almost invisible feat of historical extraction.
What did modernity do?
It kept all of the traditional male obligations the culture still demands: his provision, his grueling labor, his massive tax revenue, his physical protection in times of crisis.
But it voided the rest.
It completely voided all the reciprocal rights and respect that made those heavy obligations tolerable in the first place.
And who facilitated that voiding of the contract? The author argues it was the government. The state stepped in as the ultimate middleman.
Exactly. The government, in the author's view, didn't actually abolish the patriarchy. It simply nationalized it.
It nationalized the patriarchy.
Yes. The state positioned itself as the surrogate husband. Think about the mechanics of taxation and welfare. The state extracts resources from actual, physical men who pay the overwhelming majority of net income tax contributions.
And what does it do with those resources?
It uses those extracted resources to fund the protection and provision of women via the welfare state, the family courts, and the expansive web of social services.
But the state, acting as the surrogate husband, doesn't offer the actual man any of the traditional respect in return.
None. It demands his labor, it garnishes his wages, but it treats him as a perpetual suspect.
The modern gentleman is still expected to pay the chivalric toll.
Right. He's expected to open the doors, fund the dates, accept the blame for societal ills, and step between danger and his partner, but he is legally and culturally forbidden from receiving any of the chivalric respect or authority.
Now, here's a question that I think a lot of guys listening might be asking themselves right now. The book spends time analyzing the nice guy paradox.
So this is a brilliant section of the book.
You have an entire generation of men who decided to play by these new rules. They filed down their rough edges. They are totally compliant.
Right. They listen to the modern cultural demands to dismantle their supposedly toxic traits. They suppress their natural competitiveness, and they offer total emotional labor and provision.
So how does the author explain why these specific men, the ones who follow the new rules perfectly, seem to be losing so spectacularly in the modern dating market? Why are they mocked by the very culture that created them?
It is a brutal deconstruction of the modern sexual marketplace. The author explains that this male compliance is a conditioned reflex, artificially installed by the institutions.
The media, the universities, the progressive messaging.
Yes, this messaging demands submissive compliance from men. It tells them that being harmless and accommodating is the key to being loved.
But the reality of the market is different.
Entirely different. Because biology and the actual mating market do not reward harmless compliance. They reward competence, capability, confidence, and strength.
So the system trains a man to be exactly what women, on a deep biological level, are wired to reject.
Exactly. The nice guy is basically a product of false advertising. He provides all the emotional labor and the resources, expecting the reciprocity that the culture promised him.
And when he inevitably gets frustrated that the contract is fraudulent, when he realizes he's been sold a bill of goods.
The very same culture that trained him to be that way turns around and mocks him for feeling entitled.
That is so dark.
Riker points out that there is a hidden, highly asymmetrical property claim at the heart of this cultural mockery.
What's the asymmetry?
Female resources, youth, beauty, fertility, companionship are culturally fiercely guarded as absolute sovereign property. And rightfully so, a woman owes them to absolutely no one.
Sure.
But male resources, his labor, his income, his physical protection, his time, are treated by the culture as a collective public entitlement.
Male resources are a public utility. That is a staggering way to frame it. And the author uses a very specific piece of legal case law to prove that the state actually views it this way, right? You brought up the 2013 Petrakis prenup case.
Yes, the Petrakis case in New York is a perfect distillation of this legal philosophy.
Walk us through it.
A man named Peter Petrakis was engaged to a woman named Elizabeth. He was wealthy, and he made it clear. He refused to marry her unless she signed a prenuptial agreement protecting his assets.
He set a firm boundary.
Right. She signed the agreement voluntarily, and they were married. Years later, during a divorce, an appellate court tossed out that legally valid prenup.
Why? On what grounds could they toss a voluntary contract?
Because the court deemed that Peter pressuring her by refusing to marry her without the contract was a form of unconscionable coercion.
Let me make sure I'm following the legal logic here. A man setting the financial terms for access to his own assets prior to entering a voluntary contract is considered by the state to be coercion.
That is the author's exact point. She calls it a stunning legal sleight of hand that reveals the underlying architecture.
Unbelievable.
A man attempting to enforce the terms of his own labor and wealth becomes a coercive villain, while the woman seeking unimpeded access to his assets becomes a victim of his financial abuse.
It reveals the judicial axiom that male resources are a public utility, and attempting to restrict female access to them is prima facie evidence of an abusive character.
Exactly. And you see this exact same entitlement translating directly to the dating apps, where the evaluation of male worth is laid bare in the data.
Right, the book cites that infamous 2014 OkCupid data.
The OkCupid data is legendary in these analytical circles because it revealed the raw psychology of the market.
What did the data show?
The data showed that women on the platform rated a full 80% of all male profiles as below average in attractiveness.
Which is mathematically and statistically impossible. You can't have 80% of a population be below the median.
Exactly. It's statistically impossible, but it is psychologically revealing. It shows that the standard for male adequacy has been artificially hyperinflated by the culture, while the expectation of male provision and utility remains absolute.
The compliant man, the one who listened to the modern rules, is left holding the bill for a paradox he didn't design in a market where 80% of his peers are deemed unworthy of basic attraction.
It's a brutal reality check.
Okay, so we've established that this extraction is happening on an interpersonal level in dating, in marriage, and how we view each other. But the author argues that this didn't just happen by accident, it has been weaponized by massive bureaucratic structure.
Right, the Leviathans.
Yes, the leviathans of institutional capture. How exactly did the state take over the role of the husband on a macro level? Let's spend some real time breaking down the three major institutions she cites because these are the pillars of society. Let's start with law enforcement and the family courts.
We touched on law enforcement earlier with a 2017 California audit, where we saw the Duluth model operating in the field. But the real question is, how did local police departments across the entire country get forced to adopt these protocols?
Right, they didn't all just read the same sociology paper.
No, the answer is funding. The financial engine behind law enforcement's ideological capture was the 1994 Violence Against Women Act, commonly known as VAWA.
I remember the book stating this bill unleashed an unprecedented amount of federal money. How did it change the mechanics of local policing?
It authorized approximately $1.6 billion in federal grants over its first decade alone.
1.6 billion.
But this massive influx of cash came with very specific ideological strings attached. Police departments that adopted the mandatory arrest protocols. We discussed protocols that disproportionately target men, regardless of who actually initiated the violence, received lucrative federal grants and Department of Justice funding.
So they could buy new cruisers, hire more officers, and expand their budgets.
Right. And if a local police chief looked at the Duluth theory and said, "This doesn't make sense, I want my officers to use their objective discretion."
What happened to them?
If a department questioned the underlying theory or refused to adopt the mandatory arrest frameworks, they were cut off from the federal trough. Their budgets withered while neighboring jurisdictions expanded.
So institutional capture means the state's financial survival literally became tied to the ideological compliance of its officers.
You follow the money and you find a theology. The police didn't necessarily become ideological, they became pragmatic. They needed the grants.
And what happens when those men arrested under these incentivized protocols are fed into the family court system? What are the mechanics of that Leviathan?
The family courts operate on what the author describes as an invisible, impenetrable maternal presumption.
What's the data behind that?
She cites extensive Census Bureau data and family law analyses showing that mothers receive sole or primary physical custody in approximately 82% of contested cases.
82%. The standard justification you always hear for that number is that the mother is traditionally the primary caregiver. How does the author respond to that?
Riker argues that the primary caregiver standard is entirely circular logic designed to launder a biological bias. The mother is presumed to be the primary caregiver simply because she is the mother.
And the father's contribution.
The father's provision, his working 60 hours a week to keep the family housed and fed, is not weighed as caregiving, it is weighed merely as a financial obligation. Therefore, when the marriage dissolves, the father is reduced from a parent to a supplemental wallet.
The ultimate manifestation of state husbandry.
Precisely. The state machinery extracts his provision via forced wage garnishment, backed by the literal threat of armed imprisonment if he fails to pay.
While simultaneously granting the mother unilateral gatekeeping authority over the children's daily lives, geography, and medical decisions.
Right. The father's role is stripped of all authority and reduced to a financial substrate. He becomes an ATM with visitation rights that can be suspended or revoked on the basis of a mere accusation, often utilizing the very Duluth frameworks we discussed.
It's a staggering picture of the legal system. Now let's move to the second Leviathan, education. The book argues there is a systematic institutional pathologizing of boyhood happening in our schools. And it starts with who is actually in the building.
The demographic shift in the education system over the last 40 years is monumental, and it fundamentally changed how children are socialized.
What are the numbers?
In 1980, a typical American elementary school student had roughly a 1 in 3 chance of having a male teacher. The male presence was normal.
And today?
Today, the author notes that probability has collapsed to roughly 1 in 10. And if you look at early childhood education, kindergarten, preschool, it is closer to 2 or 3%.
The male presence in the foundational classroom has been systematically eradicated. Why did the men leave? And what is the result of that hyper-feminized environment on young boys?
Men left because the environment became hostile to male authority, and the pay didn't justify the immense risk of false accusation that comes with being a male around children today.
And the result for the boys?
The result, Riker argues, is that normal, biological masculine energy competitiveness, physical risk-taking, boisterousness, the need to challenge boundaries, is no longer managed, channeled, or mentored by older men who understand it.
Instead, it is diagnosed as a clinical disease by a female-dominated administrative staff.
Exactly. So, a 6-year-old boy acting like a 6-year-old boy is treated as a medical issue. The feminized school system demands total compliance, emotional articulation, and absolute physical stillness.
And when a boy naturally biologically resists that environment?
The system doesn't reconsider its pedagogical premise.
Yeah.
It doesn't ask, are we teaching in a way that boys learn? Instead, it offers him Ritalin as a peace treaty.
It tells him that his natural aggression is a sickness, his competitive drive is toxic, and his physical strength is a latent threat.
The author argues that we are chemically silencing young males, rather than admitting that boys are not just broken girls.
Boys are not broken girls. That is a line that will resonate with a lot of fathers listening to this. It leads perfectly into the third Leviathan the author tackles, therapy and corporate HR. How does the therapeutic industry, the realm of psychology, fit into this architecture of capture?
The author points to a very specific turning point here. In January 2019, the American Psychological Association, the APA, the premier psychological institution in the world, released its official guidelines for psychological practice with boys and men.
What did those guidelines say?
In this document, the APA formally and institutionally declared that traditional masculinity, which they explicitly characterized by traits like stoicism, competitiveness, dominance, and self-reliance, was psychologically harmful.
They literally diagnosed traditional male virtues, the very virtues that built civilization, as a mental health issue.
Exactly. It wasn't a scientific discovery based on new neurological data. Riker calls it a political manifesto dressed up in clinical citations.
So what did it actually do?
It medicalized male surrender. It instructed therapists that if a man came in suffering from depression, the problem wasn't necessarily his circumstances, but his adherence to masculine scripts.
And this therapeutic logic didn't stay in the therapist's office, right?
No, it was wholesale, adopted by corporate HR and diversity, equity, and inclusion departments, DEIs. HR stopped being about payroll and benefits and metastasized into an ideological enforcement division within the corporate world.
And this is where the author introduces the concept of the compliance tax. I really want to dig into the mechanics of this, and I want to bring in a specific recent example the book uses to highlight this absurdity.
Yeah, let's look at the tech layoffs.
Right. The author points out the massive tech layoffs we saw across 2023 and 2024, companies like Google, Meta, Amazon slashing tens of thousands of jobs. The data showed that white and Asian men, the core technical builders of these platforms, were disproportionately affected by these job cuts.
They were the ones losing their livelihoods in droves.
Yet, despite being the ones fired, the corporate diversity mandates and HR communications still actively targeted them as the privileged, overrepresented oppressor class. How does the author explain this glaring contradiction? How can you be the oppressor when you're the one in the unemployment line?
She explains it by dissecting the true function and survival mechanism of these bureaucracies. Bureaucracies, especially modern DEI and HR departments, do not exist to solve problems or increase corporate efficiency.
What do they exist for?
They exist to metabolize female victimhood and minority grievance into organizational budgets, staff positions, and jurisdictional expansion.
And the compliance tax.
The compliance tax is the literal and emotional toll extracted from masculine techno-competence to fund this parasitic apparatus.
Walk us through how that extraction happens in a corporate setting, because male competence is viewed as inherently suspect, right?
Oh, yes. The HR department functions as a parallel legal system within the corporation, and it entirely discards strict, objective evidentiary standards.
But they don't look at facts.
Under the therapeutic model adopted by HR, a woman's subjective feeling of discomfort carries vastly more institutional weight than a man's objective performance metrics or technical output.
Give me an example of how that plays out.
Imagine a meeting. If a male engineer raises his voice to forcefully debate a technical point about software architecture, he is documented by HR for creating a hostile environment or exhibiting toxic traits.
Even if he's right about the software.
Right. But if a female colleague breaks down in tears because she felt his tone was dismissive, she is offered wellness resources, paid leave, and her emotional state is treated as absolute truth.
Disparities in outcome are automatically attributed to systemic bias.
Completely erasing variables like individual choice, risk tolerance, hours worked, and occupational preference. The tech layoffs contradiction exists because the HR bureaucracy doesn't track reality. It tracks a preconceived narrative.
And what does that narrative dictate?
The narrative dictates that men must always be the oppressors, even when they're the ones being fired. Because if men are not the oppressors, the HR department loses its justification for existence.
Yeah.
It is a self-licking ice cream cone of bureaucratic survival.
It's a completely closed loop system. But hearing all of this laid out, the courts, the schools, the corporate HR departments, it begs a massive, obvious question.
Why doesn't anyone fight back?
Exactly. If this system is so heavily skewed, if the architecture of presumed guilt is so pervasive and so damaging to half the population, why don't more people notice it? Why isn't there mass organized outrage from men?
The author's answer to this is fascinating. She doesn't just blame male apathy.
What does she point to?
She points to a very specific mechanism of linguistic manipulation in media algorithms. She calls it female fogging.
Female fogging. That is such a specific term.
It is a brilliant conceptualization of institutional gaslighting. It explains why men feel paralyzed rather than mobilized. The author describes fogging as the most powerful weapon in the modern ideological arsenal.
How does fogging work?
It is the accusation with no fixed address. It floats, it mutates, it changes shape, and the moment you try to pin it down with logic or request specific evidence, you are told that your very demand for evidence is proof of your defensiveness and therefore proof of your guilt.
The fog machine. It leaves conscientious men lying awake at night trying to solve unsolvable puzzles.
Because conscientious men, especially men who are builders and engineers, are raised to believe that problems have rational solutions. They believe that conflicts can be resolved through good faith dialogue and objective analysis.
So when they are hit with a fogging accusation,
Like you're being aggressive or you're making me feel unsafe, they exhaust their mental resources, replaying conversations, analyzing their tone, searching for the offending remark, drafting apologies for crimes they can't even clearly identify.
they try to fight fog with a calculator. You mentioned HR earlier. How does this fogging actually work mechanically in a corporate or institutional setting? The author talks about a specific logical fallacy used to maintain the fog.
Yes, she applies the Motte-Bailey fallacy to modern HR and social dynamics.
Walk me through the Motte-Bailey.
It operates like this. A female employee files a complaint making a radical, highly damaging claim. This is the Bailey. She says a male colleague is harassing her, has an aggressive tone, and is creating a dangerous environment.
That is a heavy career-ending accusation. It implies a physical or severe psychological threat.
Right. So the male colleague, naturally defending his livelihood, asks the HR investigator for specific evidence. What exact statement did I make? On what date? What specific behavior was aggressive? He tries to pin down the objective act.
And what happens when he asks for evidence?
When forced to produce actual evidence, the complainant and the HR apparatus retreat to the Mott, a highly defensible, entirely subjective position. She says, I'm not saying he hit me. I'm just saying I felt uncomfortable in his presence. That's so wrong to express.
And how does HR handle that retreat to the subjective feeling?
The HR investigator, who is trained in trauma-informed protocols that explicitly treat skepticism of a claim as a form of re-victimization, records the complaint as substantiated.
Wait, really? Without evidence?
Because the feeling of discomfort was reported, and feelings, by definition, cannot be falsified. You cannot prove she didn't feel uncomfortable.
So he's penalized for a feeling.
The man receives a permanent mark on his record. His promotion is stalled, based entirely on a subjective emotion he supposedly caused, without a single objective behavior ever being verified. The fog dissipates, but it leaves a permanent residue on the man's life.
That is maddening. It is language capture operating in real time to destroy careers. And the book offers a really practical, almost mathematical tool for the listener to test this bias for themselves, especially when consuming media.
The sex swap test.
Yes, what is the sex swap test?
The sex swap test is the most efficient, brutal tool for exposing the entire apparatus of gamma bias in the media and culture. The author suggests that you take any media framing, any news headline, any sitcom script, any commercial, or any viral social media post, and you simply swap the biological sexes of the characters involved.
And what are you looking for when you swap them?
If the resulting swapped version sounds absurd, if it sounds highly offensive, or if it would be absolutely impossible to publish without massive cultural backlash and boycotts, then the original version you were looking at was pure propaganda.
The author gives a great everyday example of this, the classic doofus dad trope.
Right. Think of a standard television commercial. You see a headline or a visual gag featuring a doofus dad who can't figure out how to operate a microwave. Or a father who is completely incompetent at changing a diaper while the wife rolls her eyes.
That generates laughter. It is a standard acceptable trope used to sell beverages, minivans, and laundry detergent.
But apply the sex swap test. Imagine a commercial featuring a doofus mom who can't figure out how to operate a microwave, while the competent husband rolls his eyes at her stupidity.
The outrage would be immediate and deafening. You would have thousand-word think pieces in every major publication about media misogyny, the insidious devaluation of maternal labor, and the toxic patriarchy of advertising executives. The company would have to issue a public apology by noon.
Exactly. The test reviews the invisible scaffolding. It proves that the media operates entirely on that gamma bias we discussed. It routinely suppresses male suffering and degrades male competence, not by accident, but because the audience has been meticulously trained over decades to reflexively minimize male dignity and amplify female distress.
The media claims to challenge power, but it actually functions as a guard dog for the administrative state, enforcing the speech codes and biases of HR departments, academia, and the family courts.
And a massive part of that enforcement, of maintaining that fog, is the laundering of language, right? Redefining foundational words so that a man can't even articulate his own oppression without sounding like a villain.
Language capture is the software update that keeps the Duluth hardware running smoothly. Riker points out how foundational terms have been completely inverted. Take the word safety.
How has that changed?
Historically, safety denoted the objective absence of physical threat. Now it has been laundered through academia and HR to mean female emotional comfort or the absence of male intellectual defiance.
Trauma is another one. It ceased to describe a clinical psychiatric response to severe, verifiable danger and was expanded to become a unilateral rhetorical veto over shared reality. If someone claims trauma in an argument, the debate is instantly over.
And what about terms that are specifically targeted at men? Things like mansplaining or toxic masculinity.
Riker is adamant that these are not clinical terms or objective behavioral descriptions. They are rhetorical weapons engineered to preemptively dismiss male speech and pathologize male nature.
How does she break down mansplaining?
Mansplaining pathologizes the male communication style, which is typically direct, fact-oriented, and debate-driven as inherently condescending, regardless of the actual factual content of his speech. It ensures that a man's logic is never actually debated on its merits. It is only diagnosed as a character flaw.
And toxic masculinity is the ultimate linguistic trap. It reframes the very traditional male virtues that built society's stoicism, provision, physical protection, risk-taking as psychological defects.
If you control the dictionary, you rebuild the infrastructure of reality itself. You don't need to defeat a man's argument if you have already defined his voice as an act of violence.
It is a genuinely bleak, claustrophobic picture. We have just spent the better part of an hour touring a massive interlocking architecture of presumed guilt, evolutionary cognitive bias, state-sponsored economic extraction, and linguistic manipulation.
It's a lot to process.
It is. If a listener sitting here right now thinking, okay, I see the matrix, the game is completely rigged, the historical social contract is void, and the institutions not only extract my labor but actively despise my existence, what is the author's actionable advice?
Right, how do you live in this?
How does a man actually navigate this Leviathan without being crushed by it? This brings us to the final and perhaps most crucial part of the book, reclaiming logos and the praxic restoration.
The author's solution is uncompromising, and it might surprise people who are used to political activism. She does not advocate for legislative reform.
No reform at all.
She doesn't believe you can vote your way out of this, or petition the corporate HR department, or lobby the family court for a slightly fairer version of the Duluth Wheel. She views the institutions as fundamentally captured and unreformable from within.
So what is her solution?
Her solution is absolute individual rejection. She calls this philosophical stance reclaiming logos.
Reclaiming logos. Logos in the classical sense meaning reason, objective truth, the underlying order of the universe, the word.
Yes. Aligning yourself with objective, physical reality through reason, uncompromising virtue, and brotherhood. It begins with a profound psychological refusal.
A refusal of what?
A refusal to internalize collective guilt for historical sins you did not commit. A refusal to speak their captured language.
So language is the battleground.
The author argues that every single time a man uses terms like toxic masculinity, male privilege, or mansplaining to describe himself or his peers, he is voluntarily handing the system the whip to flog him with.
So the very first act of rebellion is linguistic. Call yourself what you actually are, a builder, a protector, a man of virtue. Do not use the enemy's dictionary to define your soul.
Exactly.
But I have to ask a mechanical question here. The author says that if you do a power mapping of this massive system, the courts, the schools, the media, it reveals that the entire apparatus is actually incredibly fragile.
Right.
Why does she believe a system backed by billions in federal funding, entrenched in the deepest levels of government and corporate America, is fragile? That seems incredibly counterintuitive. It seems invincible.
It seems invincible, only until you identify the single hidden fuel source that the entire machine runs on. The ultimate culminating thesis of Riker's book is that this massive multi-trillion-dollar bureaucratic empire runs entirely on one thing:
What is it?
male compliance.
Just compliance.
It runs on male physical labor, male tax revenue, and the male willingness to quietly, dutifully absorb the emotional and economic tax levied against them without causing a scene.
The silent sacrifice of the builders.
Precisely. Think about the mechanics. The Duluth model requires men to show up in court and confess to patriarchal sins they didn't commit to secure plea deals. Family courts require men to dutifully work 60-hour weeks to fund the very system that alienates them from their own children.
And in the corporate world.
Corporate HR departments require brilliant male engineers to sit silently through degrading diversity seminars that denounce their nature, and then still show up the next morning to write the complex code that keeps the company profitable.
The author points out that men pay the vast, overwhelming majority of net income taxes. Those are the specific taxes that fund the domestic violence shelters that explicitly exclude male victims, the university gender studies departments that pathologize boyhood, and the family court caseworkers who police fathers.
The builder is being forced to purchase the rope for his own hanging, and he's doing it because he thinks it's his duty.
But that reliance on male compliance is exactly why the Leviathan is fragile. Bureaucracies, by definition, do not generate actual value. They only extract it from those who do.
If a critical mass of men simply refuse to provide the compliance, if they refuse to use the opposition's vocabulary in the workplace, if they demand a strict, objective burden of proof for every HR accusation, if they refuse to apologize for their natural masculine existence, and if they legally minimize their taxable footprint, the machine loses its fuel.
The wheel of misandry turns only as long as men agree to lie down and be crushed beneath it. The moment they stand up and step off the road, the wheel spins uselessly in the empty air. It has no power of its own.
So the strategy isn't about fighting the system head-on in their rigged arenas. It's about withdrawing the consent and the labor that makes their arenas possible in the first place.
But I want to touch on something very specific here, because the author also explicitly rejects the black pill, right? For those who don't know, the black pill is that sense of total nihilistic despair and giving up that you sometimes see in these online spaces.
Yes, she vigorously rejects the black pill, calling it a market-driven form of pathetic surrender. Despair is just another way of being paralyzed by the system. It's doing the system's job for it.
What's her historical perspective on this?
Her historical perspective is crucial here. She reminds the reader that throughout history, men have faced famine, plague, brutal conscription, and systematic extermination, and they still rebuilt civilization from the ash.
Therefore, she argues, corporate HR departments and scolding social media mobs are not existential threats. They are merely administrative annoyances elevated to cosmic significance by a fragile, unserious culture. So what is the affirmative action plan? If we are reclaiming logos, what does that actually look like on a Tuesday morning for a guy listening to this?
It looks like seeking extreme, undeniable competence. It looks like building strict, unyielding personal boundaries. It means offering your commitment, your hard-earned resources, and your physical protection only where there is demonstrable reciprocal respect and value.
The rule is simple. Do not cast pearls before a system that rewards you with contempt.
It means seeking grueling physical challenge instead of wallowing in emotional narration. It means finding real brotherhood with other men who are sharpening their minds and bodies, rather than relying on professional, state-licensed therapists who are paid to pathologize your stoicism.
The man who masters a difficult trade, who supports a family that genuinely respects his authority and sacrifice, who raises children with discipline, and who speaks the objective truth without hedging or apologizing. That man is the living, breathing refutation of the entire Duluth model.
He doesn't need to win the debate against the captured institutions. He is the debate, and by simply existing in his competence, he has already won.
The emperor does not apologize for his existence. That is a tremendously powerful takeaway to wrap your head around.
It's the core message of the book.
All right, let's bring this deep dive to a close. We have just taken a massive, highly controversial forensic tour through the hidden architecture of modern institutions, viewing them entirely through the distinct lens of men's rights and red pill frameworks, as presented by Sophie Marie Eve-Reicher.
We've examined the history and the etymological hijacking of the Duluth model, the biological and societal engine of gamma bias, the brutal economic realities of state husbandry, and the linguistic fog used to maintain the system's power over the minds of men.
And I want to restate as clearly as possible that our goal today was impartial exploration. We aim to give you, the learner, the specific tools to understand the claims this text makes about history, institutional capture, and the systemic extraction of male labor.
It's about giving you the map.
Before we sign off, one final reminder. Please like and subscribe to the show. It really helps us continue to do these deep dives. We've been reviewing the ebook Duluth Misandry Wheel. You absolutely need to check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy it for yourself.
Read the data, look at the citations, and audit the arguments firsthand.
And do not forget to follow @Conrad Stryker at Substack for more incisive, challenging content from the author's universe.
It is a text that, once understood, will fundamentally change how you read a news headline, how you view a legal dispute, or how you sit through your next corporate HR meeting. You cannot unsee the architecture.
We started this deep dive talking about the rewritten social contract, the unsettling idea that the old reciprocal rules of chivalry were torn up, but the heavy bills for your labor and protection kept arriving in the mail anyway.
Yeah, the one-sided contract.
So I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over, something that builds on everything we've unpacked today.
Let's hear.
If the author is correct, if the modern administrative state and its sprawling institutions rely almost entirely on the silent, unthanked physical labor, the technical competence, and the massive tax revenue of men to fund the very bureaucracies she claims demonize them, what happens to the physical and economic infrastructure of our civilization if a critical mass of these builders simply follow the author's advice?
What if they actually do?
What happens if they step off the wheel? What happens if they universally withdraw their compliance, refuse to pay the emotional compliance tax, and redirect their incredible competence only toward those who offer reciprocal respect?
That's the billion-dollar question.
Is the modern system a system built almost entirely on managing narratives, laundering language, and processing grievances, actually prepared for a general strike by its own foundational demographic? When the scaffold finally stops apologizing for its strength, does the building stand or does it fall?
It's something to think about.
Something to think about the next time you're asked to sign a cultural contract you didn't write. Until next time, keep learning and keep questioning the architecture around you.